If you're so smart, then translate it. Victoria Sterling slammed her fist on the restaurant table so hard that the plates rattled and all conversation in the elegant dining room instantly fell silent. The $200 million merger agreement flew through the air before landing at the feet of David, the waiter who had dared to suggest a correction to the document she was reviewing. David Washington was 25 years old and never imagined that a simple comment about contract clauses would turn a quiet night at work at the Meridian restaurant into a public battlefield. As he gathered the pages scattered across the marble floor, his eyes remained calm, as if he had already weathered storms far worse than a billionaire CEO in the throes of an ego crisis. Victoria Sterling, at 42, had built a technology empire from scratch and wasn't used to being questioned by anyone, let alone a black waiter working the night shift. Her company, Sterling Dynamics, was about to close the biggest acquisition of her career, and the pressure of the last few months had left her nerves on edge. "Intrude," she laughed dismissively, her voice echoing through the refined dining room. "You were literally reading over my shoulder while serving dinner. What kind of establishment is this?" The restaurant manager, James Peterson, immediately appeared at the table, sweating profusely. "Mrs. Sterling, I apologize." David returned to the kitchen immediately. But David didn't move. There was something about his posture that intrigued and irritated Victoria at the same time. He didn't seem intimidated or submissive. He seemed prepared, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. "Actually," David said softly, carefully organizing the papers before returning them, "I noticed that there is an inconsistency in the third paragraph of the termination clause. The language allows for double interpretations that could nullify the entire agreement in the event of a dispute." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria felt the blood rush to her face, not just because of the waiter's audacity, but because part of her suspected he might be right. Her Harvard lawyers had reviewed that contract dozens of times, but now a seed of doubt was beginning to grow in her mind. "Do you have any legal training?" she asked, her voice laced with venomous sarcasm. "Let me guess, you watched a few episodes of a TV show about lawyers?" David smiled for the first time, a smile that didn't reach his eyes but revealed a disturbing calm. "Something like that." Victoria grabbed the contract and waved it in the air like a weapon. "Very well, waiter professor. If you're so smart, then prove it. I want you to translate every paragraph of this contract into language that even a child can understand. And I want it done here now, in front of everyone." The challenge hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Other customers in the restaurant began to turn discreetly to watch the scene, some already pulling out their cell phones. David looked around, then at the contract in his hands, and finally at Victoria with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice still calm. "Because once I start, I won't stop until I'm done. And you might not like what you find." Victoria crossed her arms, her predatory smile widening. "I'm counting on it. Let's see what you're made of." What no one in that elegant hall could have imagined was that David Washington carried secrets that would turn that public humiliation into something very different. As he opened the contract and began to read the first line, his eyes revealed a familiarity with legal documents that should never have existed in a simple waiter. There, before all the contemptuous stares, David stood firm, like someone guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If you're wondering how this story of prejudice and underestimation will end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen will completely change Victoria Sterling's perspective on judging people by their appearance. David opened the contract to the first page and began to read aloud, his clear diction echoing through the silent hall. Clause 1. Transfer of assets in the amount of $217 million upon regulatory approval. He paused and looked directly at Victoria. "In plain English, your company is buying another company for $217 million, but only if the government allows it." Victoria felt a knot in her stomach, but forced a scornful smile. "Anyone can read the first line. Continue, waiter." Clause 2, David continued calmly, 90-day audit period with unrestricted access to accounting records and intellectual property. He paused again. Translation: You have 3 months to dig up all the secrets of the company you're buying, but watch out for what comes next. The murmurs among the customers began to grow. Some people put down their forks to pay full attention. Victoria felt cold sweat on her palms, but her expression remained hard as marble. "Now we get to the interesting part," David said, turning to the third page with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to look. Termination clause for adverse material change. Here's the first problem, Ms. Sterling. He pointed to a dense paragraph. This text allows the other company to cancel the sale if there is any event that alters market conditions. The problem is that it doesn't define what constitutes significant. It could be 5%, it could be 50%. Victoria turned visibly pale. Her Harvard lawyers had charged $400,000 to review that contract, and none of them had spotted this devastating ambiguity. Wait, it gets better, David continued, now clearly warmed up. The clause allows them to keep the $20 million down payment as compensation for administrative costs even if they cancel. In plain language, they can legally steal $20 million from you. Enough. Victoria exploded, slamming her hand on the table again. I'm not going to let some miserable restaurant waiter lecture me about contracts reviewed by Chicago's top law firms. Actually, David said with disturbing calm, they were reviewed by the worst. Because any minimally competent lawyer would have spotted these traps in 15 minutes. Manager James approached nervously. David, maybe you should stop here. No, Victoria interrupted sharply, though her voice trembled slightly. Let this clown continue. I want to see how far this charade goes. But inside, Victoria Sterling was panicking. How had a mere waiter detected in 20 minutes what a team of elite college-educated lawyers had missed in 3 months of review? Even more terrifying, if he was right about these clauses, how many other deadly problems existed in that contract? David noticed the subtle change in her breathing and, for a moment, allowed himself a small internal smile. He had spent the last 7 years studying contracts just like this one, not as an academic hobby, but as a matter of family survival. When you grow up watching your mother get cheated by predatory landlords, abusive banks, and exploitative employers, you learn quickly that legal knowledge is the difference between getting trampled and protecting yourself. Do you want me to continue with the intellectual property clause? David asked, flipping through a few pages. Because this one is even more toxic. They retain rights to any innovation developed jointly, even after a separation. Victoria snatched the contract from his hands violently. It's over. I won't tolerate another second of this humiliation. James, call security and get this man out of here immediately. David stood up slowly, but showed no sign of intimidation. Of course, Ms. Sterling. But before I leave, wouldn't you like to know about Clause 17? The one that basically hands over control of your company to them in the event of any future dispute. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria froze with the contract still in her hands, her face alternating between red with anger and white with terror. Every person in the restaurant could feel the tension cutting through the air like a knife. There, before all eyes now filled with genuine curiosity instead of contempt, David stood firm like someone who had just revealed only the tip of a much larger iceberg. What no one in that elegant hall could have imagined was that this young man carried not only legal knowledge, but secrets about Victoria Sterling that would turn this public humiliation into something far more dangerous for her than any poorly drafted contract. David remained completely calm in the face of the security threat, but something changed in his eyes. Of course, Ms. Sterling. But before I go, I'd like to ask you a simple question. Have you actually read the contract you're about to sign? Of course I have. Victoria shouted, but her voice trembled slightly. Then you must have noticed that on page 47 there is a clause that allows the selling company to access all of your customer data indefinitely, even after the merger. David smiled calmly. Basically, they can steal your customer base and compete directly against you using the information you paid $200 million to obtain. The silence that followed was deathly. Victoria felt the blood drain completely from her face. That specific clause had been inserted in the last revision, and she had blindly trusted her lawyers to identify problems. You're lying, she whispered, but she was already frantically leafing through the contract. At that moment, a familiar voice echoed from the back of the restaurant. In fact, he's absolutely right. Everyone turned to see an elegant man in his 60s walking calmly toward the table. It was Robert Mitchell, the legendary corporate lawyer and senior partner at Mitchell & Associates. Victoria was speechless. Robert Mitchell was a legend in the legal world, known for saving companies from disastrous mergers and predatory contracts. He had saved IBM from a hostile takeover in the 90s and was considered one of the best corporate lawyers in the country. Mr. Mitchell? James, the manager, stammered. I didn't know you were dining here tonight. Robert smiled gently. I was at the corner table, trying to enjoy a quiet meal, until I overheard this fascinating discussion. He looked directly at David. Young man, where exactly did you learn to dissect contracts like that? David took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. Mr. Mitchell, I believe we've met. David Washington, Harvard Law School, specializing in corporate law. I worked as an intern at your firm for 2 summers. Victoria's jaw literally dropped. Robert Mitchell nodded slowly, a proud smile forming on his face. Of course. David Washington. One of the brightest interns to ever walk through my office. I remember your work on the TechCorp merger in 2022 perfectly. Intern. Victoria stammered, trying to process the information. Not just an intern, Robert continued. David here saved my client from a contract that would have cost them $80 million in hidden predatory clauses. He identified 7 issues that our senior staff had missed. David looked directly at Victoria. Ms. Sterling, I don't work as a waiter because I have no other options. I work here because it's my girlfriend's family's restaurant, and I'm helping them out during a difficult time. But my specialty is identifying pitfalls in merger contracts. Victoria felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. You're a real lawyer? Graduated with highest honors, Robert confirmed. And if memory serves me correctly, David, you only failed the bar exam by a few points due to a family problem at the time of the exam, correct? My mother had a stroke the week of the exam, David explained calmly. I chose to take care of her instead of taking the exam. I'll try again next term. The entire restaurant was now completely silent, all the customers watching the scene unfold. Victoria Sterling, the ruthless CEO who had publicly humiliated a mere waiter, had just discovered that she had attacked a Harvard-educated lawyer under the gaze of one of the country's greatest legal legends. David, Robert said thoughtfully, if I'm not mistaken, you also have specific experience with the type of contract Ms. Sterling is about to sign, don't you? Something related to Sterling Dynamics. David nodded slowly, and for the first time since the discussion began, he allowed a genuine smile to cross his face. Actually, Mr. Mitchell, I've spent the last 6 months analyzing every public operation of Sterling Dynamics. It's fascinating how some companies repeat the same patterns of legal negligence. Victoria felt the air escape from her lungs. What do you mean by that? I mean that I've identified 16 serious problems so far in this particular contract. Mrs. Sterling is about to lose not only the $200 million, but also effective control of her own company. David paused dramatically. But there's something even more interesting that I discovered during my research. Robert raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. Go on. David discreetly took his phone out of his pocket. Well, it turns out that I've been recording this entire conversation since the moment you called me a miserable waiter. I've documented every insult, every display of prejudice, every attempt at public humiliation. Victoria's blood froze in her veins. She looked around desperately and realized that several people were still recording with their cell phones. The situation had turned from private humiliation to total public disaster. You can't use that, she whispered, but her voice no longer carried any authority. Actually, I can, David replied calmly. This is a public establishment, there is no expectation of privacy, and documenting racial discrimination in the workplace is not only legal but recommended. Robert Mitchell watched the situation with growing fascination. David, may I ask what exactly his plan is? Because something tells me you're not improvising. David looked around the restaurant, then fixed his eyes on Victoria with an intensity that made her instinctively recoil. My plan, Mr. Mitchell, is very simple. First, I'm going to save Sterling Dynamics from a contract that would destroy the company. Second, I'm going to document how racial prejudice nearly cost a CEO $200 million because she refused to listen to valuable advice based solely on the color of the person offering it. Victoria looked around desperately, searching for a way out, a way to regain some dignity. But she was surrounded by dozens of eyes that no longer showed contempt for David, but rather a mixture of admiration and curiosity about how this impossible turnaround had happened. And third, David continued, his voice still calm but now laden with a determination that made Victoria realize she was dealing with something much bigger than she had imagined. I will make sure this story serves as an example to anyone who thinks they can humiliate others based on appearances or prejudice. There, in front of everyone who had witnessed her arrogance and prejudice, Victoria Sterling began to realize that she had underestimated not just a waiter, but an intellectual adversary who now had in his hands not only the knowledge to destroy her biggest business, but also the tools and personal motivation to turn the humiliation into a devastating public lesson. What she couldn't imagine was that David had planned every second of that encounter, and that the real twist was yet to come. "Wait," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling for the first time since she had arrived at the restaurant. "You said you researched my operations for 6 months? How did you know I'd be here today?" David exchanged a meaningful glance with Robert Mitchell, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Sterling, do you really believe this meeting was a coincidence? I've been working at this restaurant for exactly 3 weeks. Since I discovered that you dine here every Tuesday at 8 p.m., always alone, always reviewing important contracts." Victoria's blood froze completely. You followed me?" "I did my homework," David corrected calmly. "There's a substantial difference. You see, when Robert Mitchell told me about a CEO who was about to sign the worst contract in modern corporate history, I thought it would be interesting to intervene." Robert smiled with paternal pride. "David, tell her about the consulting." "Consulting?" Victoria repeated, her voice now a thread. "For the past 6 months, I've been working as a freelance legal consultant for Hartwell Enterprises, the company that's trying to buy Sterling Dynamics." David paused to let the information sink in. "They hired me specifically to identify all of your company's legal vulnerabilities before finalizing the acquisition." Victoria felt as if the floor had literally disappeared beneath her feet. That's a conflict of interest." "Actually, it's not," Robert interjected professionally. "David never signed any confidentiality agreement with your company, and you just publicly humiliated him based purely on racial prejudice. He has every legal right to use knowledge gained through public research to protect you from your own incompetence." David took out his phone and began typing rapidly. "Speaking of protection, I just sent an email to the Sterling Dynamics board with a complete analysis of the problems with the contract. 16 critical points that your lawyers missed, including a clause that effectively hands control of your company over to Hartwell in 18 months. You can't do that." Victoria screamed, trying to grab the phone from his hands. "I already did," David replied calmly, showing her the screen. "Email sent at 9:15 p.m. to all board members, with copies to the SEC and 3 journalists specializing in corporate mergers whom I know personally." Victoria looked around desperately. The entire restaurant was now paying close attention to the scene, and at least 10 people were recording with their cell phones. "You don't understand. This merger represents 2 years of work. If she doesn't go through with it, Sterling Dynamics could go bankrupt." "Sterling Dynamics will go bankrupt if the merger goes through under the current terms," David replied firmly. "But now it won't, because the board has enough information to renegotiate or cancel it completely." Robert Mitchell watched the situation with professional fascination. "David, show her the most interesting part." David smiled for the first time since the beginning of the evening, but it wasn't a cruel smile. It was the smile of someone who had planned every move perfectly. "Mrs. Sterling, do you remember firing a junior lawyer 3 months ago? Kevin Thompson? You claimed he was incompetent and unsuitable for the corporate environment." Victoria paled even more. "What does that have to do with anything? Kevin is my cousin. And he sent me copies of all the emails you sent to Human Resources describing why he should be fired. Emails full of coded racist language and comments about how people from certain backgrounds don't fit into the company culture." "That's a lie." Victoria protested, but her voice carried no conviction. David showed the screen of his phone again. "I have 47 emails from you over the course of 6 months. All documenting a clear pattern of racial discrimination disguised as cultural inadequacy. And now I have tonight's recording, where you demonstrate the exact same behavior in public." Victoria tried one last desperate card. "I'm going to sue you for defamation, for invasion of privacy, for—" "Why?" Robert Mitchell interrupted gently. "For saving your company from a disastrous contract? For documenting racial discrimination? For exposing legal incompetence that would have cost shareholders $200 million. He paused dramatically. "Ms. Sterling, if I were you, I'd be thanking me, not threatening me." David calmly put away his phone. "My work here is done. The Sterling Dynamics board now has all the information it needs to make intelligent decisions. Journalists have a fascinating story about how racial prejudice nearly cost a company $200 million. And you have a valuable lesson about treating people with respect, regardless of their apparent position. Victoria sat down heavily in her chair, finally comprehending the magnitude of what had happened. In a single night, she had lost not only the biggest deal of her career, but also her reputation, her authority over the board, and possibly her job once the story became public. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do this?" David looked at her with a serenity that cut deeper than any anger. "Because people like you believe they can humiliate others based solely on appearances. Because someone needs to demonstrate that knowledge and competence have no color. And because the best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with excellence." There, in the middle of that elegant restaurant where it had all begun with contempt and humiliation, a lesson was being written in real time about the consequences of underestimating people based on prejudice. What no one could have imagined was that that night would be just the beginning of much bigger changes in both their lives, and that the real transformation was yet to come. 3 weeks later, Victoria Sterling sat alone in her executive office, watching through the 30th floor window as security guards packed her personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The Sterling Dynamics board had voted unanimously for her removal as CEO after the devastating analysis David had sent revealed not only contractual problems, but also a systematic pattern of legal negligence that had cost the company millions in previous settlements. The story had gone viral on social media in a matter of hours. The video of David's public humiliation at the restaurant, followed by the revelation of his true credentials, had been shared over 2 million times with headlines such as "Racist CEO Destroyed by Harvard-Educated Waiter," and "The Moment Prejudice Cost $200 million." The comments were relentless, and several companies had already canceled contracts with Sterling Dynamics citing incompatible values. David, on the other hand, had received 47 job offers in the last 2 weeks, including proposals from 3 of the country's largest law firms and a position as senior legal counsel at Hartwell Enterprises itself. Robert Mitchell had personally recommended David for a junior partner position at his prestigious firm, completely bypassing the traditional years of experience required. But the offer that interested him most had come from an unexpected place. A group of investors had offered him full funding to start his own law firm specializing in protecting small businesses from predatory contracts. David Washington Law Office for Business Justice already had a waiting list of 300 potential clients, mostly small business owners who had watched the viral video and recognized someone who truly understood their struggles. Kevin Thompson, David's cousin who had been wrongfully fired, received $800,000 in an out-of-court settlement when Victoria's discriminatory emails became evidence in a racial discrimination lawsuit. He used the money to finish law school and became the first official employee of David's new firm. The merger between Sterling Dynamics and Hartwell Enterprises never happened. After David's analysis was validated by independent auditors, Hartwell withdrew its offer completely, citing unacceptable governance risks. Sterling Dynamics, now under new leadership, managed to survive, but Victoria lost 90% of her shares in the company in settlements with angry investors who threatened lawsuits for fiduciary negligence. Robert Mitchell became David's official mentor and often told the story of the Meridian restaurant in lectures about how unconscious bias can cost companies fortunes. "In 30 years of law," he would say, "I've never seen anyone identify so many contractual problems in such a short time. And I've never seen anyone lose so much money by simply failing to see beyond the color of someone's skin." James Peterson, the restaurant's manager, promoted David to unofficial legal advisor to the establishment after discovering that 3 of the supplier contracts contained abusive clauses similar to those David had identified in the Sterling case. The restaurant saved $200,000 in the first year just by following David's recommendations. Victoria tried to rebuild her career, but her history followed her like a shadow. Executive headhunting firms stopped returning her calls, and when she finally landed a position at a smaller company, she found that she was constantly monitored by diversity consultants hired specifically to prevent similar incidents. 6 months after the incident, David returned to Meridian for the first time since that transformative night. This time, he was wearing an impeccable suit and accompanied by 5 clients who had flown in from other states specifically to meet the lawyer who had become a legend on social media. James greeted him with a genuine smile and led him to the same table where it had all begun. "Funny how life works," David said to Robert Mitchell, who had joined them for dinner. "If she had simply treated me with basic respect that night, I would have pointed out the problems with the contract discreetly, she would have thanked me, and her company would be worth $200 million more today." Robert laughed as he raised his glass of wine. Arrogance always comes at a price. But in this case, the price was an education for a lot of people. David looked around the restaurant, taking in the same elegant tables and sophisticated decor, but now seeing everything through the eyes of someone who had turned a moment of humiliation into the foundation of an extraordinary career. He had learned that true victory wasn't in destroying Victoria Sterling, but in building something greater than she could ever imagine. The best revenge, David discovered, is not to repay the damage done to you, but to achieve such brilliant success that the opinions of those who doubted you become irrelevant. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift anyone can receive, because it removes all expectations and allows you to surprise the whole world. If you've ever been underestimated because of your appearance, background, or social status, leave a comment about how you turned that into motivation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that intelligence and dignity always win over prejudice, and that sometimes the most powerful people are exactly those no one expects.